I want to draw our attention tonight to the 4th chapter of Colossians, verses 7 through 11. Talk about strengthening the congregation through giving. Paul writes to these brethren, "All my state shall Tychicus declare unto you, who is a beloved brother and a faithful minister and a fellow servant in the Lord, whom I have sent unto you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate and comfort your hearts, with Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. They shall make known unto you all things which are done here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. And Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom ye receive commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. And Jesus, which is called Justus, who are of the circumcision, these only are my fellow workers unto the kingdom of God." Watch this line. "Which have been a comfort unto me." It can be dangerous to visit a friend who's in prison, even one who's imprisoned falsely and unjustly. Prison officials can view us with suspicion when we go in there. They'll usually watch every move we make and check us in and check us out. It takes a lot of courage to keep in close touch with a person in prison. Yet these friends of Paul did exactly that 1900 years ago. They did not hesitate to visit him in the Roman prison and to bring him much needed comfort and encouragement and strength. Well, who are these fellows? And what can we learn from them about strengthening a congregation by giving of ourselves, our time, our money, and our efforts? Let's go back to AD 60 for a moment. In this letter, Paul, from prison, singles out 5 Christians who stood with him. Notice the name Tychicus, always mentioned with Trophimus most of the time. This is a personal messenger or envoy for Paul. He calls him a fellow slave in the Lord and a faithful servant in the Lord. But notice who it was that we sent back to Colossae with Tychicus. You ought to recognize this name Onesimus. That's the slave that Paul converted in prison, who belonged, the slave did, to Philemon. And Philemon lived in Colossae. We also know who the preacher for Colossae was. That's Epaphras. And so we have 2 fellows here, one of whom was in prison with Paul, but he's able to be a beloved brother and faithful now. Notice that. Then there's Aristarchus. This guy was from Thessalonica in Macedonia. And at one time, a fellow captive of Paul's. He'd been in prison too. Now he was doing some other things, delivering messages to the church at Colossae. Then he mentions Mark, and that's interesting. Mark's the one that Paul did not want to go with him on the second missionary tour. But you remember that Barnabas took Mark and Paul took Silas. Paul and Barnabas had a big argument over whether or not they should take Mark. But notice that Mark is coming now as a messenger from Paul to the church at Colossae. And then the last one he mentions here is Justus. And he calls Justus a fellow worker. Look at those terms about faithful folks. Beloved brother, fellow slaves, faithful. Well, someone you know well because we've given you commandments. Here's a former Jew who's now a faithful Christian. But all of them are fellow workers. And I think that's related to the fact that they were willing to visit Paul in prison. Now look at the word comfort for a moment. The only time this particular word is used in the whole Bible is found at the end of verse 11. And it's not really the word comfort, it's the word paragoria. And paragoria means a strengthening aid. Paul actually said that every one of those men were strengthening aids to him. Something they were doing strengthened Paul. Tychicus, Onesimus, Aristarchus, Marcus, and Justus, all were strengthening aids. They were giving Paul relief, solace. The King James has comfort while he's in prison. Something about their presence strengthened Paul. But notice what he called them: fellow workers, faithful, fellow slaves, etc. And I stop here and wonder out loud why it was that Paul would need a strengthening aid. Is he not an apostle? Has he not seen the Christ? This word, paragoria, is a medical term. It's as if these folks gave him some kind of an elixir when they showed up to be there in the prison with him. They gave him a strengthening aid. Did he need that? Look over 2 Corinthians 11 with me for a moment. Paul have any suffering as a human being? This list is overwhelming, is it not? I mean, he had everything happen to him that you could mention and then some. I don't know if he listed everything that did, but he certainly went through a lot. There in verse 24 he says, 5 times he got beaten by the Jews. That's 195 lashes on his back. That's a lot of beatings. He was beaten with rods by the Romans 3 times, stoned at Lystra and Derbe, you remember. 3 times suffered a shipwreck, and that doesn't include the one we read about in Acts. He had to travel a lot. He was in trouble on the sea. People held him up. He was robbed. His own countrymen bothered him. The pagans bothered him. The city people bothered him. The country people bothered him. He was out on the sea and had problems, and false brothers troubled him greatly. But notice this, he was up a lot. Weariness. I know about that one. He was up. That's what that means. He said to stay up all night sometimes, preachers, to do his work. Pain. Watchings. That's another one about staying up a lot. He had to be alert for various things. Sometimes he was hungry, thirsty, didn't have enough to eat, cold, didn't have enough clothing. He told Timothy on one occasion when he was the second time in the Roman prison, bring the cloak. It's cold in this dungeon. And then the care of all the... Did he need comforting? Something to strengthen him? He's human. I want you to go home tonight and memorize Luke 22:43. Think you should. We're in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. That's the Son of God, deity. But he needed something. And he needed it, and angels came and did it. They came and strengthened him. I've never been in such agony that my blood came out the pores of my skin. I've never suffered that kind of trauma, hematidrosis. But he did. Even our master needed strengthening. Brothers and sisters, every time you and I walk through that door together, There's a certain strength we get just coming into the building together. And when we help one another with whatever it is, it's kind of like good medicine. It's an aid to us. So what happens when I'm not here? Look at Acts 28 with me for a moment. And here is another statement about Paul and strengthening. How do you strengthen a congregation? This is verse 17 of chapter 28. And it came to pass that after 3 days Paul called the chief of the Jews together, and when they were come together, he said unto them, Men and brethren, though I have committed nothing against the people. Here's a man in prison unjustly. Don't you think he needs strengthening? He knows he hasn't done anything wrong. And certainly these brothers took their own lives into their hands going into that prison to see him. In those days, that was very dangerous. He had not committed a sin. He was unjustly committed. Look while they're there in chapter 28 now, over to verses 24 and 25. Even though he's unjustly in prison, he's preaching to them. But look at verse 24. Now, we just read in 2 Corinthians 11 the care of all the churches, but something even pained Paul more. Something he needed strength even more. Some believed the things which were spoken, and some believed not. I know that pained him. He needed some encouragement here. You know, I was preaching all day long and nobody obeyed the gospel. Preacher students, that's going to happen. You'll need strengthening aid to preach, and they don't believe. They don't accept it. They don't want it. They reject it. You're going to wonder. But just remember, there are folks supporting you to do that. Preach it. They are behind the scenes with their wallets strengthening you. Of all the people in the world, you preacher students are the most fortunate of all. Watch this. You get paid to study the Bible all day long. You talk about strengthening them. Look at Romans 9, 2 and 3. Paul felt the pain of the loss so greatly. He said, I could wish myself a curse from Christ for my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. When he knew they were lost, it hurt him so bad. He needed somebody around him to strengthen him. And these men came at great cost to their own welfare. They were messengers of this very letter we're reading. I don't know if they brought reports to other congregations, but I know Paul had a lot of folks doing that for him. And they certainly brought reports to Paul about what was going on. But Paul tells us here in verse 10 of our text that Marcus was one that they had been told about. When he was in prison the second time, he asked Timothy to bring the New Testament and Old Testament scrolls to him. These people would go to these prisons to aid him, to build him. Look over at Ephesians 6, 21 and 22. It's interesting, and I think Dennis is teaching a course on Sunday morning on some of these fellows, but it's interesting what they were doing. I call these men second fiddles because second fiddles give the harmony to the orchestra. These fellows aren't as well known as Paul or Peter or those fellows, but here's Tychicus again. But that ye also may know my affairs and how I do. Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, shall make known to you all things. That's at Ephesus. And so we know these men went all over the place reporting to Paul and reporting to the churches what was going on with Paul. They supported him. Watch it. So he could be a strengthening aid to everyone else. How do you strengthen a congregation? Just help one another in any way you can. Look at Acts 20:35. We're so familiar with the first part of this verse, we forget, or the last part of this verse, we forget the first part, I think. In the last part we read, it's more better to give than to receive. But notice the middle. So laboring, what's he say? You ought to support the weak. Why do you work? Why do I work? Look at Ephesians 4:28. Let's find out why we work. That is, why do Christians work? What's my purpose in earning money? Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him work, labor. Working with his hands the thing which is good. Why? So he can put it in one of those storage units, right? Build up his bank account, his retirement. People ask me all the time, are you going to retire? To what? My retirement's out of this world. I can't retire. I don't know what I'd retire to. If you are retired from a secular job, now's the time to come to school. Let him labor, working with his hands with the thing which is good. What's he to do with that money again?
Give it.
Okay. Let's take up a collection right now. Huh? Are you primed? The working with his hands that he might have, watch it, to give to him that needeth. That's a tune. I don't want that thing. Those credit cards are dangerous. Don't use them. I won't pay somebody else to use my money. Look at 1 John 3:17. How do you strengthen a congregation? You just show up and you help any way you can. It's not that hard, but you have to show up. Here he says, whoso hath his word's goods, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion against him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? Well, it doesn't, of course. And so, laboring, you ought to support the weak. Have to give to him that needeth. See your brother have need, you help him. Something's troubled me for 58 years now. I don't understand it, Gage. How many of Christian men should it take to support one missionary? Think about that with me for a minute. If each one of those men gave 10%, what would the missionary get? 100%, would he not? He'd be equal with whatever they were getting. Is that right? But for some reason, we only have about 400 missionaries out there from 3 million people. So it takes 4,000 of us, according to that, to support one missionary. Something wrong. Not sure what it is, but that's no strengthening aid. I challenged them at South Haven one Sunday. Scared one fellow to death because he carried $20,000 around his wallet all the time. But Tony, I told them one Sunday to reach in their wallets and get all their cash and put it in the plate and see what happened. See if God blessed them. Some of them tried it and he did bless them. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but I think that we need a revelation about our giving. And I want to talk about that in just a minute. But let's ask that question right here. Go back to Colossians 4. How can I be a strengthening aid? Well, I've already learned it takes courage. These fellows had to go into a prison. That could have been a matter of being put to death if they weren't careful. So they had to sacrifice to do it. But Paul accepted their help, and that's important too. It could be that I have not experienced the fact that I too am human and need help sometimes, because that takes humility. And so maybe being a strengthening aid is going to be coupled with the fact that I am humble enough to realize that I may need help someday. That takes humility to admit that. Well, Paul accepts their generosity quite well here. But even our master needed comfort. If you look at Hebrews 5:7, you read a strange phrase there. It says that when he was in the garden, he had tears and strong crying. He was crying out loud in that garden. He wasn't weeping in silence. He was crying out loud, strong crying. He needed comfort. Already, everybody does. And maybe if I'm going to be a strengthening aid, I should start with the thought, maybe I'll need help one day. I know that takes some humility for some of us, but good results come from that kind of thinking. Look at these fellows here who were willing to help Paul at the risk of their own lives. I know we live in a world now that tests our faith. Maybe we always have. But all over the world now there is trouble. Everybody needs a little strengthening aid. Our children do. While you're there in Colossians, look at 3:21. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Even our children need a strengthening aid. Elders need a strengthening aid. Romans 12:3. Deacons need a strengthening aid. It's not a bad thing to tell the deacons once in a while how well they're doing or how well you appreciate what the elders are doing. I hear that a lot in our prayers here. I really appreciate that. I know the Lord does. Well, how do I become a spiritual strengthening aid? I give regularly. I do not donate to the church. And I need to understand the difference there in order to be a strengthening factor in the congregation. A giver is far different from a donator. Some people just tip when they like what the preacher said, but we don't even want to talk about that. That's not a strength. I give regularly from my gross income if I'm a Christian, because God will not allow me to give anything but the first fruits to Him. And my giving is a part of my worship to Him. And so I have to give from the first fruits, not the net, not what's left over after taxes, but what I got initially before taxes. And so I give regularly, which fortifies the weak, strengthens the congregation, and puts the congregation in a position to help those. Look at 1 Thessalonians 5:14. This is a challenge to a congregation and the individuals in it. 1 Thessalonians 5:14. Support the weak. And so that's a direct command there. That goes along with visiting them, talking to them, and maybe giving to them. But we need a revelation. And I think we need a revelation about our money. I know that my students have known me to ask them to show me your wallet. Brother Cook, could I see your wallet? You got it with you? Which one of you wants to show me his wallet? No, that's God's wallet. I want to see yours. Did everybody get that? We need a revelation about money. Look at Luke 16 with me. This is one of those misunderstood parables, mistaught parables, because folks don't understand, I guess, what Jesus was trying to get across here. This is a parable about a rich man who had a steward, and I'm a steward of everything God has given me. And this steward was wasting the rich man's goods. So the rich man called him in, verse 2, told him what he was hearing, and told him to give an account. While the rich man is talking to him, this fellow starts thinking, what am I going to do? I'm about to get fired. What am I going to do? I can't dig, and to beg I'm ashamed, he says. He's too lazy to work, and he doesn't want to beg. So the way he is, he's going to cheat his master again. Watch. I'm resolved what to do, verse 4, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him and said unto the first, how much owest thou unto the Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. He said, just write down 50. He's cheating his master again. But he's doing something that the Lord is going to commend here in a moment. That's what's so important about this parable, because it gives us a revelation about this thing we call money. He goes to another and he said, how much do you owe? And he said, well, 100, write 80. Now look at verse 8. And here's where people misunderstand. And the Lord commended the unjust steward. Why? Because he planned for his future with what he had. Even though he cheated to get there, but notice what the master calls him. The children of this world are in their ways wiser than the children of light. Sometimes they understand something out there in the world that we don't ever get in the church. What is it he's trying to tell us? This fellow was taking care of his worldly future. Question: am I taking care of my heavenly future? Look at verse 9 now. Here's the point. He tells his disciples now, after he told them that story, he says, make to yourselves friends of money. That's the mammon of unrighteousness. And when you die, it will receive you into an everlasting habitation. Now notice what he calls the money here. Mammon of unrighteousness. He calls it the least. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. He that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If you've not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to you trust the true riches? And if you've not been faithful to that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? I recommend that everybody memorize the serial numbers on his dollar bills, to make sure that when you get to the judgment day, they belong to you, because they're going to show up again, folks. That's what he's telling us right here. He's going to check and see what we did with our money, because it's nothing more than a tool to him. It's the mammon of unrighteousness. And when I'm in love with it, watch what he says. No servant can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. The Pharisees got it. Look at the point they got. And the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they got the point. We need a revelation about our money. It's a tool, nothing more. Cannot be a goal. Can be a hammer, a saw, a screwdriver. But that's all it is. It's a tool, and we have to remember it belongs to God, so how are we using it? And I think with that in mind, I can probably have the courage to help somebody who needs help. No doubt about it. I want to suggest something else that will strengthen the congregation. I think we should let the preacher know that we are receptive to sermons on giving, and we're not opposed to it. In fact, I would demand it from him. Brother Whitaker told us, our sister Hayes, have you got all of Brother Whitaker's sermons on giving? Probably. He preached 5 times a year on giving at Night Arnold. He told us he did that to remind the brethren. He was not afraid of those sermons. Look at the contribution at this congregation, incidentally. I would demand from Brother Kane that he preach on giving. And then I would think, if I'm going to strengthen the congregation, I have to remember that I'm worshiping him with my money. I'm giving it back because it's His anyway. He just let me use it. And so God said, make to yourselves friends of your money, because then it will receive you into your everlasting habitation. What in the world is it to be generous? Well, let's go to Acts 4:32. I had not been in the church very long, maybe just a few weeks. This happened up in a northern city, and I was standing in the hallway, and a sister said to me, how are you coming in your Christian growth? I said, well, I don't know. She said, well, let me ask you a question. Would you go to the bank and borrow money for me? I had no idea what that had to do with Christian growth at that time, but I do now. Look at Acts 4:32. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. They never said any one of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. Church, let's be committed to making God's people a priority in our lives. That's being generous. I put that first. These people gave their possessions to the others who needed it. It's a principle of generosity. It won't match what God did for us in giving us His Son. But certainly, when I become a giver, I am a strengthening aid to any congregation. There's a sad statistic that 14% of the people give 90% of the money. Why don't we increase that? And let's do even more to strengthen the work here at Forest Hill. Thank you for your kind attention tonight.